Hello and welcome. I'm Delana Sepko.
And I'm Trish Kale.
You're listening to Aye Lassie, which is a 3-part series that introduces you to Scottish women's history. We think that there are generations of extraordinary Scottish women who in their own ways have helped shape the world we live in now.
But we noticed that some of our heroines have been misrepresented or almost forgotten. So we're excited to have the chance to tell you about them and their work.
In this episode, we'll have a look at Scottish women's suffrage movements and hear about some of the women and events in this chapter of women's history in Scotland. To do this, we'll pick up around 1830 and finish in 1928. This is a dense period for social campaigning, and not just in Scotland, but in the whole of the UK. And there were a lot of people and organisations involved. Some were in favour of women's votes, some were against, and it took a long time to resolve it. So the first part of this episode isn't comprehensive. It's meant to give newcomers to the subject some insight and hopefully spark some interest. For those listeners who are already savvy, we hope that you'll hear at least one thing you haven't heard before. Today, all British citizens over the age of 18 have the right to vote. But that hasn't always been the case. What is suffrage? It's the right to vote in public elections, including local and national. Suffrage is also sometimes called franchise or the franchise. What was all the fuss about? Political representatives like MPs were the decision makers, and their decisions had a direct impact on the daily lives of the population. In the early part of the 19th century, approximately 3% of the British population had the right to vote. In 1831, that percentage was even less in Scotland, with a reported 4,500 voting men out of a population of 2.6 million people. The right to vote was based on wealth, which included property, and only rich men met the criteria. That meant rich men made decisions about what was best for rich men, and not necessarily anyone else. The Reform Act of 1832, which is also called the Great Reform Act, was the first of a wave of suffrage reform campaigns and parliamentary bills aimed at balancing what some considered an unequal distribution of parliamentary seats and the franchise. In this first version, voting rights were extended to more male property owners and to male householders that paid more than £10 a year in rent. And this reform doubled the number of eligible male voters from 1 to 2 million. However, this was the act that explicitly excluded women. Up until this point, there was no act forbidding women from voting except convention. But the 1832 Act specifically defined voters as male. It's important to say here that in the beginning, suffrage campaigners weren't asking for all women to get the vote. They just wanted it for women who met the same voting criteria as men. But the problem was property. Owning property was a fundamental requirement for voting, and women weren't allowed to own it. In 1867, the Second Reform Act was defeated in Parliament, and this time, campaigners got organised. Suffrage societies popped up all over the UK and included the Edinburgh National Society for Women's Suffrage, not just Scotland's first, but one of the first 3 in the UK. So what did suffrage societies do? In the beginning, they hosted drawing room meetings and invited politicians and government influencers. They also collected signatures for petitions and coordinated with sympathetic MPs to introduce parliamentary reform bills. As the national part of the Edinburgh National Society for Women's Suffrage suggests, they were often local branches of national societies. So they were linked to other groups working and campaigning in the rest of the UK and even in the United States. And who joined these societies? Middle and upper class women were the first members because they were more likely to have the means and the time to participate. To help explain who these women were, we spoke with Claire Thompson. She's a librarian and a researcher, and she's been looking at Scottish women's contributions to the suffrage campaigns. She also shed some light on the crossover between the women's suffrage movement and other social campaigns.
Margaret Irwin, who was one of the founder members of Glasgow and West of Scotland Association, was also the president of the Glasgow Council for Women's Trades, and she wrote pamphlets and books and contributed to government consultations on sweated industries, so women sitting in the house making handkerchiefs out of their sewing machines for absolutely no money. And so she used those strategic skills and that strategic approach to try and make a difference to the women who were doing those things and who didn't have the time to be active about it. So it shows the kind of intersection of that particular approach and the people who were affected by it. You know, people, they weren't just in it for themselves, they were in it for womankind. My mum always sort of talks about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So if you are a person who is desperately working for half a penny for a handkerchief and has got 6 children and her husband is working 12 hours a day, her needs are food, a secure roof, an affordable roof over her head. But the women who have more are then able to sort of widen their needs, and they're able to sort of not, because they don't have these basic things to worry about, then they can. So it's about class. It's about how do people that have more needs become involved in activism? How do they? I don't know. And it has to be really about what they need from their community, and it's about enabling people to do that, I guess.
As Claire mentioned with Margaret Irwin, there was a lot of crossover between social movements. Women's suffrage wasn't an isolated issue, meaning women didn't all wake up on the same morning and say, "I'd like to vote, let's make it happen." It was part of a much larger umbrella of social activism, and it included women's suffrage as well as women's higher education, employment, working conditions, housing, and health. Women like Margaret Irwin didn't see a line between one and the others. These social concerns were connected, and not just in their aims to improve living and working conditions. They were also connected by the people who participated. And that's why it's difficult for us to tell and share stories about women like Margaret and their work in the suffrage movement and not mention the rest of their work that they did. Today, we don't necessarily want to leave it out, but today we don't have enough time to share it all. Nonetheless, we press on to 1872, when women's suffrage campaigners took a small step forward when the Scotland Education Act created roughly 1,000 new regional school boards. Municipal franchise, which is the right to vote in local elections, was finally granted to women. And this meant that not only could they vote for school board candidates, but they could also run. This achievement was great, but not nearly enough. The 1881 Married Women's Property Act granted property ownership rights to married women in Scotland. Until this point, a man assumed control of all his wife's assets, including property and all money, whether she earned it as a wage or through inheritance. This change in Scotland happened 11 years after it was introduced in England. In 1897, lots of suffrage societies joined up and formed the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, and it was led by Londoner Millicent Fawcett, who would go on to lead the organization for another 20 years. The NUWSS was a constitutionalist organization, so in their efforts, they kept up with gathering signatures, introducing parliamentary bills, and holding more and more drawing room meetings. There was a lot of activity down south in London because that's where Parliament was, and still is. The Constitutionalists staged demonstrations outside meetings where MPs or the Prime Minister would hear their shouting or see them gathered outside when they left the building, and suffragists, which is another name for the Constitutionalists, would attempt to hand over petitions. Claire explains why she admires the suffragists' work.
I'm particularly inspired by the work of the constitutional suffragists, so the ones that weren't militant.
The ones that didn't break the law.
No, the ones
Right.
that didn't break the windows, the ones that didn't stand on roofs and shout. They used strategic methods to try and influence the people who were already in power. So in Glasgow we had the Glasgow and West of Scotland Association for Women's Suffrage, which was a branch of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. So they had been really around from the late 1860s onwards, kind of having bits and bobs of meetings here and there, really quite closely linked to the Liberal Party in Glasgow.
Okay.
And they used methods to influence those in power. So they would have a drawing room meeting where this MP would be invited, or a city councillor or whatever would be invited, and it would all be sort of very polite, and they used these kind of soft influencing skills, but they did it for a long time, and that's what I admire. It was they must have sort of, and they came across so many people saying, no, I think you might have to wait a bit longer.
Right.
And they kept the heat when that happened. They were like, right, okay. They regrouped and they said, right, we'll have another drawing room meeting, and another, and it went on and on. So that was really 1902. They were founded officially in Glasgow. Some people left the group, like people like Marion Gilchrist and Janie Allen. They were annoyed at the lack of progress being made.
Sure.
Round about 1907, they could see all the kind of militancy starting to happen. First people went to jail, I think, in about 1906. And they were like, right, this is enough. No more drawing room meetings. And I feel that the WSPU and the more militant groups get so much credit for their bravery and their wonderfulness and their throwing of bricks and stuff, and that was very, very brave. But in the background there was this strategic work going on. And I think that it needs to get more credit for the, it wasn't the suffragettes that got the vote.
Well, that's very much the long haul, though. I mean, that's a different kind of investment and commitment to something.
Yes.
I'm not saying that it's easy to throw stones through windows, and to work up to that, for it to happen, to actually go through with it, and then to suffer the consequences afterwards. Like that's for sure one sort of commitment and a certain type of bravery, but this longevity, this ability to stick with it, to take no it over and over and over again, but not take it as the final answer. Yes. There's a real sense of commitment and like long-term investment in that I find quite inspiring too.
Yeah. No, absolutely. You can see it was actually reported in the newspapers. I think it was 1905. They went to the North British Station Hotel to meet David Lloyd George, who was, I think, the Secretary for State at that time, and it was all quite a lot of the speeches were recorded, and this woman, Nellie Galbraith, who's always reported as Mrs. James T. Hunter, but her name's Nellie Galbraith, and she was from Rutherglen. She spoke to David Lloyd George, and she said, this is why we want it here. It's about justice, it's about laws that affect women and children, and we think we should have a say in it. And he said, yes, well, there might be another petition to Parliament in 2 years. And they took it so politely, and then they went back and they had their meeting and they made minutes about it, and then they meet the next month and the next month, and it's just the tenacity of it. When they knew it wouldn't happen straight away.
Campaigners had a lot of opposition, and they had to work very hard to get across their views and hopes for gender equality. And that's what this was about, gender equality. Not just votes for women, but what that meant in society. However, progress was slow, and some activists grew impatient. By the beginning of the 20th century, so that's the early 1900s, campaigners had been pushing for women's franchise for about 70 years. That's a long time to be told over and over again, no hen, no the now. Emmeline Pankhurst, an Englishwoman living in London, was very active in the women's suffrage campaigns, and so were her two daughters, Christabel and Sylvia. But in 1903, she split away from the NUWSS to form the Women's Social and Political Union. Emmeline and others were frustrated with what they saw as a lack of progress, and they decided to switch up their tactics and adopt direct action. So what was direct action? The suffragettes, as Emmeline and the others became known, believed that deeds and not words would convince the government and the public to give them the vote. Direct action was the sharp end of their stick. They threw things, they broke things, they burned things down. And they did it to get more attention for their cause and to prove that at least some of them weren't going to take no for an answer anymore. There are a lot of instances when Scottish suffragists and suffragettes went down south to join in campaigns. And as we've already seen, that makes sense considering that's where Parliament was. But Glasgow, Perth, Dundee and Edinburgh were also hotspots for campaigning, and they attracted others to join in north of the border. Sometimes they came from even farther. Claire tells us about one such woman.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say about people going to London, but because the research that I've done has been based around Glasgow and trying to find the places in Glasgow where things happened, I've found a lot of, read about a lot of instances where people came to Glasgow. So an American, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, who was also American, were sent by the Women's Social and Political Union to Glasgow to infiltrate a meeting at St Andrew's Hall, and Alice Paul, the night before the meeting, climbs up the back of St Andrew's Hall, which is about 60 feet, something like that. We don't know how she did it. She must have climbed on a thing, a sort of shed or something like that, but she got up there, she spent the night there, and it was absolutely peeing rain, and the only thing she had to eat was a bar of chocolate, and then she was discovered in the morning at 6 o'clock, and the guys that were working on the Mitchell Library, which was being built at the time, saw her, and they thought she was a drunk or something like that, and they started sort of throwing little rocks at her and stuff, and she woke up and she told them what she was doing. She was a suffragist, and she was staying there so that she could sneak into the meeting, and the guys at 6 o'clock in the morning, like the labourers, were just like, we'll just leave her to it, and they basically didn't dob her in, because they were like, and you go ahead on yourself, which I quite like. She's dead lucky. But then it came to 12 o'clock and the foreman came up, and he noticed her, and then he was the one that kind of phoned the police and all that, and then they got her down. But I quite like that kind of on your cell hen.
It was a very sort of Glaswegian attitude to it. Yes.
And then there's a kind of interesting one where someone from the Glasgow and West of Scotland Association, they were campaigning in Camlachie, which is quite a very working class area, with this guy called William Merlees, who was from Cambridge, and he was from Glasgow, but he had moved to Cambridge and then came back, and he was going to be an independent women's suffrage candidate. And this kind of very prim and proper Glasgow and West of Scotland woman is reporting it in the Common Cause, and she says, we had a lovely after work meeting with all the men from the Parkhead Forge, and they stood in the rain and they were all dirty, and we just really enjoyed a great back and forth and stuff, and you just wonder like what's the reality of that.
What actually
like
happened?
Throwing eggs at her or whatever, but he got 35 votes in Camlachie for that general election. He did not do well. So the way she's talking about it is, a smashing bunch, but I don't know if any of them are actually voting for William Merlees. But he was the father of Hope Merlees, who's a famous poet, I found out. So I guess it's all about like the things that happened in Glasgow, and it's about a sense of place. So the Scottishness of the campaign you can only get a sense of it until you know about it.
Sure.
And so the Glasgow Women's Library have been doing like suffragette walks, where they do the research and then they walk around a particular place and say, this is where this happened and this is where X threw a brick. And but that's what we need to build a sense of what the Scottish suffrage movement is, for people to go to sort of recognise and have that sense of place and have that deep knowledge of it. So I think that that's our job.
When suffragettes like Alice Paul were arrested, they were put in jail. If this happened in London, they were sent to Holloway. If it happened in Scotland, they were often sent to Perth, and neither was an easy place to do time. Once in prison, some women went on hunger strikes because they believed that they should be classed as political prisoners and not criminal prisoners. But the hunger strikes began as one woman's individual act of defiance. In 1909, Marion Wallace Dunlop decided to forego food and water, and she lasted 91 hours until the prison doctor released her for fear of death. She was the first of many who went on hunger strike, and after seeing how the authorities reacted, the Pankhursts included and encouraged hunger strikes as part of their WSPU direct action campaigns. The government had two responses to the strikes. The first was to force feed imprisoned suffragettes using tubes and liquid food like eggs and milk. This method was dangerous because it caused the prisoners harm by breaking their teeth or inducing bleeding, vomiting, and choking. As another form of protest and a sign of solidarity, fellow activists staged 24-hour vigils outside Perth prison gates. In 1914, in Scotland, Ethel Moorhead, already well known to the authorities for her role in militant activities and stints in prison, was the first suffragette force-fed in Scotland. By this time, England had already adopted the countermeasure, but Scottish suffrage campaigners had believed the authorities would never condone it. Glaswegian Janie Allen, an active member of the WSPU, said it this way: "Forcible feeding in the case of Miss Ethel Moorhead came as a shock to most of the public. It had been fondly believed that this barbarity was to be left to England, but last week it was proved that, however enlightened the Scottish public may be, the commissioners still have ideas only suited to the Middle Ages, when torture and witch burning were considered quite ordinary occurrences." The government's second response in 1913 was the Temporary Discharge for Ill Health Act, also known as the Cat and Mouse Act. Now, the government could release a prisoner when she was deemed too weak from her strike. However, that release was only temporary. She was allowed to regain her health, only to be rearrested to serve the remainder of her sentence. In fact, most were supposed to return on their own, but very few actually did. These labels, suffragist and suffragette, were important to activists and the media at the time. Before some campaigners took up direct action, there was no need to differentiate. They were all suffragists. But when the militant tactics gained popularity, the suffragists did not want the so-called bad behavior of the militants to reflect badly on their efforts so far, which had been up to that point law-abiding. Names did matter, and they were used to draw clear lines between the two kinds of groups. There was always opposition to giving women the vote, and until the turn of the century, it was the politicians that made the most noise against it. But as militant actions were adopted, there was more public disapproval. There were large parts of the population that included both men and women that were anti-suffrage. In the beginning, they were passively opposed to extending the franchise, meaning they didn't engage publicly with the issue. But as the campaigns for women's vote gathered support and campaigners started using militant tactics, the anti-suffrage supporters organized and pushed back. Like the suffragettes and the suffragists, the anti-suffragists started organizations to champion what they felt were valuable gender differences and frustrate attempts to pass parliamentary reforms. And then something happened that changed everything, and that something was World War I. From the start of the war, in 1914, Emmeline Pankhurst and her fellow WSPU members suspended their militant activities and instead helped recruit women for the war effort. In 1916, the UK introduced the Military Service Act, and it meant all single men between ages 18 and 41 had to enlist. A sizable chunk of the UK's male workforce voluntarily enlisted during the first week of war, and while meeting resistance from employers and unions, women were taken on for those roles in what was called dilution. Even though employers, who were mostly, if not entirely male, objected, they didn't have much choice. So they hired women and paid them less, and were comforted by the fact that women had to give these jobs up once the war finished and the menfolk came back home. Once mandatory conscription happened in 1916, there was an even bigger hole in the workforce, and the need for female workers became even greater. In Scotland, women worked in the shipyards, which would have been unheard of before 1914. But the war needed ships, and the ships didn't build themselves. So between 1914 and 1918, Clydeside shipyards produced 481 ships, and women played a large part in making that happen. Dr. Elise Inglis, founder of the Scottish Women's Suffrage Federation, and one of the first females to graduate from the Edinburgh University Medical School, she started the Scottish Women's Hospitals, even though she was reportedly told by an official from the War Office to, quote, go home and sit down. Inglis and fellow Scotswomen took their offer to the French government, and with funding from the constitutionalist NUWSS organization and the Red Cross, they set up auxiliary hospitals in France, Corsica, Malta, Romania, Russia, and Serbia. They worked as doctors, nurses, ambulance drivers, cooks, and orderlies. Inglis was even captured by the Austro-German army, and it took intervention by the American and British authorities to get her released. In 1918, after roughly 85 years of campaigning, the Representation of the People Act finally passed in Parliament, and it granted voting rights to women over the age of 30 who met minimum property criteria. One part of the act enfranchised all men over 21, regardless of property ownership, and we must recognize this as an achievement for men who were previously excluded because of this requirement. The other part of the act granted voting rights to women over the age of 30 who owned, or their husbands owned, property or land with a rateable value greater than £5. Women university graduates over 30 who were voting in a university constituency were also eligible. So, why 30 years of age? Lord Robert Cecil, a rare conservative supporter of women's suffrage, put it simply. The reason why the age limit of 30 was introduced was in order to avoid extending the franchise to a very large number of women, for fear they might be in a majority in the electorate of this country. It was for that reason only, and it had nothing to do with their qualifications at all. No one would seriously suggest that a woman of 25 is less capable of giving a vote than a woman of 35. The electorate tripled from 7.7 million in 1912 to 21.4 million in 1918. Because so many men died during the war, women would have become the voting majority if they were allowed to participate under the same terms as men. That possibility was simply too much for the government and the public, and so 30 was the almost arbitrary age applied to women's franchise. 1918 also saw the Parliament Qualification of Women Act, and gave women over the age of 21 the right to stand for Parliament. Yup, you heard that right. A 21-year-old woman could be a member of Parliament, but couldn't vote until she was 30. By all accounts, there was still much work to be done, but partial enfranchisement was the biggest result to date. After the Qualification of Women Act in 1918, the WSPU disbanded, and the NUWSS became the National Union of Societies for Equal Citizenship. There were still many differences between how men and women were treated, and the new NUSEC agenda was to push for reform on issues like equal pay, divorce law, pensions for widows, and guardianship of children. This time, women were able to address these concerns as members from Parliament. The 1918 general election was the first time some women could vote and stand for office, and some women won. For example, Scotland's first female MP was a woman named Catherine Murray, the Duchess of Atholl, and oddly, before 1918, she was anti-suffrage. She also opposed and voted against the issues brought up by the NUSEC. In 1928, Parliament passed the Representation of the People Equal Franchise Act. Finally, after almost 100 years of campaigning, all women over the age of 21 could vote, and there were no more property restrictions for either men or women. To help give us another perspective on Scottish suffrage campaigns, the women who were involved, and the overlap between social movements, particularly here in Glasgow, we asked the Strong Women of Clydeside group to tell us about their work.
My name's Leslie Mitchell. I have a wide interest in history, in sociology, in social history, in the way that women's voices have been lost over time, in the way that women are still treated poorly as second-class citizens, and how we can use what we find in history to inform the current day to improve everybody's lives.
And my name is Tara Bell. I'm an artist, and I just recently finished some research work with the University of Glasgow working with the Riverside Museum.
Strong Women of Clydeside, would you mind maybe telling us a bit more about the group?
I started it in 2013, and we met for the first time in April. And it's basically a team of people who are looking into and trying to sort of uncover or recover or dig and find women's histories, or histories of women's involvement in very specific, we started out looking at very specific protest movements. And this began partially as a way to both really celebrate and highlight what women in Govan have done in as activists over 100 years, and partially as a way to look at all of that and how it maybe was represented in the Riverside Museum, which was kind of new at that time, and how it could be maybe represented better at the Riverside Museum. That was kind of our initial brief. And I kind of pulled a really amazing team of people together, several of whom are still involved 5.5 years later, which is amazing, and others who've come on since then, like Leslie. And the team itself decided in 2013 we were going to start looking at 3 protest movements, and those were the 1915 rent strikes, the 1971 Upper Clyde Shipbuilders Work-In, and the 1996 community takeover and sit-in of Kinning Park Complex. And we were looking really specifically at women's roles within all 3 of those events, those political movements or moments, and also really looking at kind of the landscape that they happened within. So we were wanting to really anchor it very specifically in Govan, very specifically in these streets, these towns, these tenement, these communities, this particular place, and try to understand that better.
Are there any women that you've come across that you found maybe inspiring, or do you think that maybe more people need to know about, or anyone really that has really sort of touched you in that sort of way? Are there any women in particular that you can think of?
So many.
We could talk about them all day.
You start.
I mean, you look across. Obviously, Mary Barber has had quite a publicity.
She is. She's a local celebrity.
Yeah. A local celebrity. But still, I saw recently a Facebook post where someone said, I know we've got the Mary Barber statue, but are there any other statues of women in Glasgow? And it was like, well, yes, actually, just along the road from Mary Barber, there's Isabella Elder in Elder
right.
Park. And so to talk about all the things that she did as part, just did amazing things for Govan, which at the time wasn't actually part of Glasgow. So I mean,
No, it wasn't.
There's things that people don't realise, that they don't understand. And you go from there and you look at what Mary Barber did, and it's not just the rent strikes. She goes on to be a politician, she goes on to be a councillor, a Bailey. She opens a clinic in Govan, which is still an NHS clinic.
On Arklet Road.
On Uplet Road.
Jeez, oh.
Just behind Isabella Elder statue.
Which is still providing medical services, you know, literally generations later. So it's actually an amazing, and we found an image. One of our team members is a really an incredible kind of, he has an incredible ability to dig into the archives. Ian McCracken, who also works with Govan High and is a retired archivist there. So, and Ian found an image of Mary Barber at the opening of this clinic, and actually we know because through the census that she would have lived at that time. She would have lived, and when the rent strikes were in action, she literally would have lived about a block and a half away on well, it's now Uist Street, but it was at that point URE Street. Anyway, sorry, probably too much detail, but forgive us. But you know, so this is something that literally was around the corner from her house, and that she was absolutely integral to the starting up of that clinic. So this is someone who is incredibly passionate about women's health, about family, about the health of children, children's welfare, and just general kind of medical facilities. And this is, like, I think a lot of the interest of a lot of the women that she was also working with at that time, who were campaigning for better housing, was literally all about that. It was about providing places to live for families which were safe, which were healthy, which were where you know they were able to raise their children.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that people think of when they think of Glasgow are those amazing photos from both the end of the 19th century that Thomas Annan did, but also later into the 50s and 60s, of the back courts of tenements where kids are playing in filth, and the kids are hanging around on street corners and stuff. And there's this understanding of Glasgow as being an incredibly depressed place.
Yes.
But it's also worth remembering that points in history, Glasgow has been incredibly rich.
Yes.
As has Govan. And so one of the things we're able to do is show how those changes in social mobility and so in the social structure were important to the way that the women lived, the way that they were able to function, because women's voices, those voices, the housewife, just doesn't get recorded. So you have to find the points in history where the people are speaking, and then extrapolate from them. And that, I think, with the work that we've managed to find some of these women's speeches about housing, their essays about how to keep your house clean, how to make dinners, the fact that Isabella Elder set up a home economics school, so that if you were living on a very small budget, as unfortunately many people are today,
and it's still relevant today, a lot of this.
No, how to feed your kids on next to no money, and still get them to grow.
I mean, there have been a few points in listening to you speak that I've gone, well, that still applies, and that still applies, and that still applies. So to me, there feels like there's a really, like that those efforts and those needs that these women were trying to address, they are still needing to be addressed. You know, they haven't been resolved entirely. Maybe, you know, some conditions have improved, some services have been made better or added. To me, I think that there's probably more to be done, you know, in the work that some of these women started.
One of the things that we do is we host walks. So we kind of call them art walks because there's lots of sort of creative interventions, and we kind of do a lot of sort of temporary graffiti and shouting and singing and hollering and walking about Govan and and carrying banners and stuff. But it's in a way it's sort of like a guided walk plus, you know. And we have always started roughly at Govan Cross. Sometimes we've included the museum, but we started at Govan Cross and then ended at roughly Elder Park, 10 Hutton Drive. One of our walks is happening on Saturday the 9th of March. This one, so all of the walks we've done, we've been doing these sort of art walks, these performative kind of guided tours since 2013. This one is really focused on Mary Barber. Now, we've actually not focused on her so much in the past. We've always woven her in with all of these other protest movements, but we're really wanting to just celebrate the fact that her statue is up. It's exactly 1 year since her statue went up on International Women's Day last year. So, and we wanted to really celebrate the work of the Remember Mary Barber Committee and all of the people who donated and that kind of long journey, and also her life and all of the things that she has focused on. So the walk is Saturday the 9th of March. We will start at 12:30 at the Mary Barber statue, and we will kind of walk along down Govan Road, roughly ending at 10 Hutton Drive. We'll go through the park, we'll talk about Isabella Elder, we'll talk about the 1971 UCS work-in, but we'll really focus in on Mary Barber, and everyone is very welcome to join us.
So not only do we do the walks, but we've also hosted Wikipedia editathons, and
which has been great. It was a learning curve for us as well. And a way for us to kind of gather some of the stuff that we found, our archive, and really...
Yeah, I mean, so Wikipedia is this amazing thing where anyone can edit it, but the problem is that it's massively gender biased because it's gender biased to the people who are doing the editing.
Sure.
So what we're able to do, along with a number of amazing women around the world, is just increase the number of women who get spoken about on Wikipedia. And so we've worked with Sarah and Delphine from Wikimedia to put together afternoons, days, depends on the timing, where we bring our research, and the last one we held in the Mitchell Library, so we were able to bring some of the stuff from their archives and some of their books, and introduce people to the concept of editing Wikipedia. Because most people have heard of Wikipedia, but don't necessarily realise that they can have an impact on it.
And this is a way that they can very easily contribute and have an impact. Even if it is seen as a smaller one, or felt like a smaller one, it all adds up. Especially if you're saying that a lot of these voices aren't even represented there to begin with. It's really important that you start to invite these folks around who have these nuggets to plant them wherever they can, and then that becomes a more robust resource, particularly for women's stories.
Absolutely. So that's given us the opportunity to meet other people, to engage with other people's research, to help other people put their research out there. So we helped expand the information on the Kidden Park Women's Cooperative Society.
Another amazing organization. So I mean, I think the more you start to dig, well, it depends, but we've been both, quite determined and jammy, I guess, at some points.
Absolutely.
And the combination of the two means that there is a lot of information that we found that we've been trying. And there's some of our team members are actually absolutely brilliant at just writing entire Wikipedia articles. So there's a huge number. There are a lot of women now represented, Scottish suffragettes, I should say, as well as Scottish women doctors. Some of the first, women artists. There's like a nice kind of intersection between the Lady Artist Society and
the women, the female doctors. They were both middle class groups. But the women who had come from Glasgow School of Art and the women who had graduated from the University of Glasgow met as part of the suffragette societies, and so they came together. And so you've got the lady artists helping produce banners and flyers and putting on exhibitions,
which we're very interested in because we do all that.
It's wonderful for providing inspiration. But then you've got the doctors And from the doctors you can sort of follow different things. So I mean, you can follow from Marion Gilchrist herself to her niece, who worked with her for a while, but who was also a surgeon during the First World War in one of the hospitals in Doncaster, because all of the other surgeons were away with the army, and who had turns up in the newspaper having had a terrible experience where one of her patients has died, and she's had to go to an inquest about why her patient has died. And it turns out that she was basically operating on her own.
Right.
Doing surgery, complex surgery, with nobody in the room but a nurse who was trying to keep the patient under anaesthetic. And so just interesting links provide you with the opportunity to go, I mean, yeah, the rabbit hole of research is quite terrifying.
To tell us more about how Scottish suffrage campaigners and other notable women's stories are being shared, Dr. Sarah Thomas and Delphine Dallison talk all things wiki.
So hi, my name is Delphine Dawson, and I'm the Wikimedian in residence at the Scottish Library and Information Council. So my role is basically working across all of the public libraries in Scotland, training them on how to edit Wikipedia, and also giving them different strategies for how they can look at uploading some of their really diverse and rich collections onto the online encyclopedia. So we've been working with all sorts of different librarians and travelling all across Scotland, and now we're reaching the end of my residency. But as a legacy, we're going to have a network of librarians who know how to edit Wikipedia, and also are trained on how to train other people to edit Wikipedia. So hopefully this is going to be a long-term project that's going to carry on going after my time is done.
And I'm Dr. Sarah Thomas. I am the Scotland Programme Coordinator for Wikimedia UK. Wikimedia UK is the UK chapter of the Wikimedia Foundation, which is the international charity that stewards the Wikimedia projects, of which Wikipedia is one. My job involves speaking to museums, galleries, libraries, educational institutions, heritage organisations, all kinds of different partners across Scotland to increase their open knowledge capacity. So that's helping them get volunteers involved, helping them open up collections, helping release things on an open licence. We do a lot of work in terms of underrepresented content, getting things available on open licences, to making them publicly available to anyone who wants to access them. We do work in education and in literacies, and we do work around advocacy and policy, making things more open and more accessible to the general public.
One of the things that I've heard the Strong Women of Clydeside speak about, and I would be really interested to hear more from you guys, is what are these editathons that they have mentioned that they've been involved in? How do they work, and what do they hope to accomplish?
So an editathon is a focused period of, usually Wikipedia, Wikipedia editing, where you take, you have three things that you need for an editathon. So you need a gap in Wikipedia, so somewhere where there's a subject that's not covered. Because although Wikipedia, especially English Wikipedia, is big, there are definitely gaps. So you need a gap in Wikipedia. You need some sources or some resources that can help you fill that gap. So specialist knowledge that can be from a library or a gallery or a university, something like that. And then you need a group of volunteers, willing and able Wikipedia editors, who will then take those resources and will take the training that we'll give them within that editathon session. And then they will help to fill that gap in Wikipedia. So it's about writing new articles to fill those gaps in knowledge, and also improving articles that already exist.
And there's all sorts of different ways in which you can contribute. There's all sorts of things like taking photos, adding sources, and adding actually little bits of information into existing paragraphs and things like that of the encyclopedia. So your contributions can be very big, you can create a whole new article, or it can be something smaller if you don't necessarily have the confidence to do that. There's lots of different ways in which you can contribute to Wikipedia.
Yeah. There's a niche for everybody. That's what I love about Wiki. It's what I love about all of the projects. It doesn't matter what you're interested in, or what your speciality is, there's a niche for you there.
Yeah. You did the editathon with the group.
Yeah, we've done a couple.
I'm going to ask you a bit more about that then, in that it sounds like there was a gap there, and that you guys came together to help fill that. So could you explain a little bit more about that?
Well, when we talk about, we talk about underrepresented content within the encyclopedia. So we know that, although English Wikipedia especially is very big, we know that we have some quite significant gaps. And one of those is to do with gender. We have a bit of a gender gap. So there is a gender gap in terms of the kinds of people that edit our editors. We don't have enough women editing. We don't have enough trans people editing. And then we have a content gender gap as well, which means that anything really to do with women's history isn't very well covered.
And that's not necessarily Wikipedia's fault. It's kind of it's a reflection of the way women's history has been covered in general, historically up till now, which is that historically women's history has not been very well covered in secondary sources. It's not been very well written about. A lot of the time, history books are focused on the achievements of the husband, rather than talking about what the women have actually achieved themselves. And it's something that academics and researchers all over the world are working to rectify at the moment. But until we have those secondary sources, it's very difficult to represent that on Wikipedia.
Yes.
So, and that's where having the strong women applied, who were very passionate about the history of women in Glasgow, had the interest and had done all that research in the first place into the history of women in Glasgow, then meant that they'd done all the hard work of uncovering the sources and things like that, and then we could give them training to actually add that onto the encyclopedia. So I think
it's that dedicated group of volunteers who are really interested in a subject, who know where to go to find the information, and who have that deep subject knowledge. Which means that they're perfectly placed to be able to know what's missing in the first place, to know where those gaps are, and to have that information to go and fill those gaps.
One of the things that a lot of people don't realise is that Scotland as a whole is considered an underrepresented area on Wikipedia, and I think a lot of people get a bit surprised by that, because if you look at all the big hits they covered, all the national monuments, the well-known kind of. But then when you look down at a more local level and you start looking at local monuments, local notable figures, local history and things like that, then you start finding a lot of gaps. And that's where libraries have those kind of very specific collections that kind of cover more of that local knowledge, but also they do the work with volunteers who are already doing local history research and so on. And if you can tap into those two things, then you can start improving the coverage of content. It's important for for people in local areas to actually find themselves represented on Wikipedia, because if you actually start finding that local history on Wikipedia and so on, then it validates where you come from, your history, your heritage, and all those kind of things. And as we've said, there is a gender gap in editors as well as there is in content. As a result, unfortunately, Wikipedia represents the interests of the people who are editing it. So that means military history, very well covered. Women's history, we're still working on that. When you are putting up articles online, there will be admins who, this is the normal course of any article anyway, is that they get checked over by admins who will look at the validity of the sources and how many sources you've used and whether the person is notable enough, etc. And then we can come across a lot of challenges in terms of is this person notable enough to be on Wikipedia and so on. It gets a little bit frustrating when very minor baseball league players will have these massive articles that don't get questioned at all. But on the other hand, you try and write an article about women and straight away you're challenged about whether they're notable enough, etc. I think that's where the Women in Red project comes in, and they've actually done a lot of work to actually bring together a community of editors that actually are very proactive.
The Women in Red project is actually, I think this is right, so a wiki project is a group of editors who really want to edit about one particular subject and they focus on that area. So military history, I believe, I didn't check this before I came out, but military history is the busiest wiki project, but actually the second biggest, most active, I'm not quite sure how to measure, wiki project is Women in Red.
Okay.
So, and the idea of Women in Red is to turn red links blue, and red links are ones on Wikipedia where you see a red link, it means that article doesn't exist.
So it's basically, so these blue links are the internal links that go from one article into another. It's our kind of way of creating pathways of research so that you can, if you want to find out more about something in an article, you'll create a blue link that will take you to another page in Wikipedia that you can find out more.
And that's how you fall down a wiki hole at 3 a.m. in the morning, and suddenly
We've all done it.
And suddenly you
We've all
know
been
much more
there.
about theoretical physics than you did an hour ago.
So these red links are kind of internal flags as wiki editors that we leave for each other of this is a topic that's notable enough that it deserves to have a page, but it doesn't currently have a page. So if you come across a red link, it's kind of like a nudge to say, maybe if you have the time and the interest and you know about the subject, you can create a page on this. So Wiki Project Women in Red, what they do is they create lists of red links for notable women who don't currently have a page. And every month they create new themes. They send those out to editors that are involved in the project, and you can either choose to edit part of those themes where they give you these lists of red links for women, or equally you can look in your local kind of context for. So we've done a number of Wiki Women in Red editathons. I ran one not so long ago in September. We did a 2-day editathon on the Aye Lassie, particularly looking at improving the coverage of the history of women on the Aye Lassie. So we did that in partnership with Atlas Art and the local library and the local archives. And this was a culmination of an Atlas Art project looking at the history of women in Skye as part of the 100th year suffrage anniversary. And what we did is we basically went through and looked at women who had been notable both in the past and in the present day, and the library and the archives helped us find all the sources that we needed, and then we spent 2 days actually creating articles and editing them, and as part of that we ended up creating 13 draft articles. 8 of those have now been published. A few more of those still need a little bit of work here and there, a few extra sources and things like that, but are going to get published in the future. And yeah, it's just helped kind of highlight some of the missing history basically of women on the Isle of Skye. And I think especially when you're looking at small communities like that, where you're growing up in those communities, you want to have role models, people to look towards. And there were some amazing women that they fought in the Second World War, they went to create hospitals on the other end of the world, and this is, in the 19th century. And there's some amazing women artists and all sorts of writers and so on. So, I just think that means that kids now growing up on the Isle of Skye will have new role models that they can aspire to.
You mentioned that there's a list that happens. Is this the best way to sort of have for folks to have a look and see if this is the best way to kind of get involved?
Yeah, I think if you especially if you're looking to do anything around women's biography, Wiki Project Women in Red. They're also on Twitter, so you can find them on Twitter. They're very active online. And the information that they give in that Wiki project is really good. They've got great guides for how to write a biography. They've got really good guides into what happens if one of your articles is challenged, and they're very open and friendly, and they're really lovely people.
In the next episode, we'll leave 1928 and jump to today. We'll catch up with the Glasgow Women's Library to find out more about the legacies left by some of the women we've come across. We'll also hear about the ways the GWL keeps their stories alive.
We'd like to thank everyone who helped put together episode 2. That's Claire Thompson, Leslie Mitchell, and Tara Beale from the Strong Women of Clydeside, Dr. Sarah Thomas from Wikimedia UK, and Delphine Dallison, the Wikimedian in Residence of the Scottish Library and Information Council. We'd also like to thank Sunny G Radio, Lisa Donati from Gia Laldi, Bryony Cullen, and Kirsty Mooney. Thank you! Want to find out more or listen to this show again? Head on over to sunnyg.com/Aye Lassie to play this and other episodes as many times as you like. You can also check out extra materials related to each show. Feel free to get in touch via our Twitter account, that's @Aye Lassie Radio, and let us know what you think.